Hello everyone, and welcome to Deckbuilding Derezzed. I am your host, Code Marvelous, and today I'm joined by a friend from the Swedish meta, Sysp.
Hello.
Now, Sysp created a very interesting deck that you may have seen, the Hammer Party Edward Kim deck that was Decklist of the Week, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to have you on the channel, Sysp. Thank you very much for joining me to go over it.
My pleasure.
But before we get into that, why don't you tell me a little bit about how you got into Netrunner and, kind of the genesis of this deck.
Right. How I get into Netrunner. Basically, I started playing CCGs back in '94, I think it was, with Magic. And I've been playing like pretty much everything since then. I guess I just love the card games somehow. And then actually I did play the original Netrunner as well, mostly around 2000, I think, was mainly when I played it a lot. And by the time it came out as an LCG, I was interested, but I was pretty heavily invested in Scrolls.
Okay.
The digital CCG that Mojang created of Minecraft fame. I usually delve so deep that I don't have time for more than one at a time. So I was like, okay, nice, Netrunner came out. That could be something later. And then when Scrolls defuncted, basically I came into Netrunner and started picking that up. And been playing that mainly for the last couple of years.
Awesome.
Yeah, and the deck, I think the initial seed, I think that I looked at the Fall Guy Film Critic source engine maybe 6 or 7 months back when I saw it in Sunny.
Right.
And I thought that this is really oppressive as a lock, but the problem there, of course, is that Sunny is slow as molasses, so she sets up her drip so extremely slowly.
Right.
So I kind of filed that at that point. I think around the turn of the year, can't remember what card spawned. I think it was maybe the last Heap Breaker that came out when I did the first draft of this deck, because then I started tinkering with like Oracle May and stuff as well. So that's basically when it started. Then the last iterations of the list were refined over the last few months. Archivist was maybe the last add, but then I started really going into it and trying to get it into like good shape. So that's where it's at the moment.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming on. As I mentioned before we started recording, this deck is what this channel is all about. Like, you take an interesting idea of something that's a line of thought that a lot of other people wouldn't think of, and you combine a bunch of different interesting cards to create a deck that functions in a way pretty much fundamentally different from a lot of the other decks that we're seeing right now, right? I'm going to put this in the category with like the Theophilus Bagbiter CT deck and stuff like that, where you're creating a powerful effect by exploring a line of play that most people don't even consider.
No, exactly.
So, why don't you lead the way? Tell me a little bit, Sysp, about what kind of like the key combo pieces are that make this deck go. We'll start with those. And actually, before we do anything else, he doesn't get played super often. So Edward Kim, for those of you who may not be aware, is the Anarch that trashes the first operation he accesses each turn at no cost. Now, it's worth noting that this is not a may, it's a must. And he's got 1 link, and he is shredded.
It's actually worth remembering also with the ability, because we're going to come into variants of this deck later. And when you're running archives, of course, it turns off. If there's any operation in there, the ability turns off, and it comes up fairly often in here, so it could be worth mentioning also.
Okay.
It's an interaction. Where should we start? Do you want to start with resources or icebreakers? Because there's only those two categories in the deck.
It's your Hammer Party, man. Where do you want to start?
Let's start with the resources then. I think we can just say that we're running the Heap Breakers, and then we're good with the icebreakers.
Yeah.
They are pretty shitty, but we have the drip to make up for it, and for obvious reasons later we can only run Heap Breakers really efficiently.
Well, 2/3 of them are shitty. Paperclip is incredible.
Paperclip is awesome.
Yeah.
But Black Orchestra and MK Ultra are really just there for you're breaking a lot with them still, but you're reliant on getting those nice like 7 drip turns to to fuel them continuously. So you still have to be somewhat restricted on how many runs you're making.
Right.
But paperclip, of course, is the bomb.
Is great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Clippy's pretty rad.
Yeah.
So I'd say we should probably start with Oracle May, because it's a card
Right.
that hasn't gotten use in a ridiculously long time, but it's kind of the central power piece of this deck, and it's the primary econ and draw engine, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it combines both, which is really what like a drip deck needs. I mean, you want some econ early to be able to play out your stuff, but at the same time you also want to draw. Especially the combo with off-campus apartment is the kind of the key to the deck.
Yep.
The problem with some campus apartment decks is that they run out of steam if you don't draw enough resources
Right.
or other connections.
Right. And it's
May
worth
solves that a bit with it giving you like a regular draw every turn that you can still gain 2 of. So
right. And it's worth noting that this problem of needing draw and money simultaneously is one of the reasons that Sunny, as you mentioned earlier, is really hard to play, because every card that she has that does that costs a lot of influence for her.
Exactly. I mean, May still costs a little bit of influence, but it's still worth running 3 of them. And it's also one of the good benefits of her is that we're actually running a fair amount of uniques in this deck that we're running 3 of.
Right.
So we do get dud draws, but on the other hand, May draws are not really duds in that sense. I mean, you get to draw it and still gain 2, so basically you're opusing, and you didn't get the card this time, so boohoo. But at least you got 2 from your click, so I mean, it's not the worst thing if you actually draw and you need an additional copy of something you have out there. That's a nice thought on it.
And to explain to our viewers exactly what this card does. So Oracle May cannot be used more than once a turn, and you hit it for a click, you name a card type. So resource, program, hardware, event. And then you reveal the top card, and if it is that type, you draw it and gain 2 credits, otherwise you trash it. So the reason why this works in this deck is because all but 6 of your cards are resources.
Right.
So you could pretty safely say resource and hit a card. And if you don't, you put a conspiracy breaker in the trash, which is where you want them anyway.
Yeah, I mean, basically then you don't get, if you mill a breaker, then you don't get 2 creds from the draw ability, but you still it's still almost like you drew the breaker. You managed to put it into the trash for 1 click, which is not bad either. So, and the thing with Oracle May, of course, is that you could combine her with like motivation and stuff to look at the top card, but this deck kind of circumvents that necessity by only running resources, really.
Right.
So it's kind of neat like that, and that combos well with off-campus apartment, which might be the next one we're talking about, I think.
Sure. So off-campus apartment is a location that can host any number of connections, and it basically replaces the click that you spend putting the connection on there with a free draw.
Right. And obviously it kind of feeds into itself then also, because if you play a connection there, you might draw a connection, and then you play that one and you still draw. So you're getting a lot of free draw, which is great because then you can just spam out stuff. When you play this on the Enteki and so on, it almost looks like you're playing a corp deck because your area becomes so wide after a while when you're just installing. And it's not uncommon to be like a good part of your deck through maybe 30 cards down, like 5-6 turns in, just because that you aren't spending any time drawing cards. You get all of those clicks almost for installing instead. So you're kind of like usually drawing in the beginning maybe 3 to 5 cards, depending on exactly what you're at with all of the other stuff. So
right. So what is the next card that you think we should talk about in the resources category?
I think Street Peddler is a good one. This might be one of the best decks of actually getting value out of the Street Peddler, because if you install it on like off-campus apartment, not only do you get 1 extra draw there, but if you actually pull a connection from it also, lower it by 1, and then you put that one also onto an off-campus apartment to get another draw. So not only are you like getting a card selection, you're digging through your deck, you're lowering the install cost, but you're actually getting true draws out of it often. And if you also mill manage to hit one of the heap breakers and get that into the bin as well, I mean, it's just value city. So.
Right. You're compressing you're
Yeah.
compressing a lot of value into one click with a peddler onto off campus in this deck.
It could be worth mentioning also with Street Peddler that it's not automatically that you always play it. Late in the game you don't play it, because then you still want to keep your deck. I mean, if you're light down to maybe 15 cards and you have gotten most of your stuff out already, you still want May to be able to fire.
Right.
So at that point you actually stop. Sometimes you even stop. At some point you also stop installing onto the off-campus apartment, because you actually don't want more draw. You just want drip at that point.
Right.
So then you try to keep cards in the deck still, so that May can draw them and still get creds from them. But
that's a good point.
The other thing, well, of course, is that you're facing a lot of net damage. After you found your film critic, usually you don't need to install Peddler. It's usually like if you can get the source, the lock that we're gonna talk about very soon here. If you can get the lock there so they can't never advance on the board. If you have that up, you don't really need to install Peddler anymore. But Peddler actually helps in getting that established fairly early, so you don't get a lot of problems with net damage decks.
Having played a few test games with this myself, one of my all-time favorite things to do with this deck is have the source on a Peddler, and people start advancing, and then I bring it out by surprise.
Yeah, that's
like almost like a instant speed clot.
Yeah.
And it's just, it gives people the sads.
And then you also draw a card from it when you install it onto the off-campus apartment on their turn. So
yeah, it's really good.
Drive it, install it for one and get a card from it, and they can't advance. It's pretty glorious. So it gives you some hidden information as well, and it's also good for digging for certain cards. I mean, there's a couple of combos in the deck that we're gonna go through, and it usually helps finding the missing piece, because some of the combos aren't really good when you only have one part for the combo. So.
All right.
What else can we talk about? I think that maybe we should mention then the lock that the deck is trying to get to, because it's really about that, and that is the source.
It's got two of my favorite Netrunner jerks on it, Thomas Haas and Smoke on it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's never bad. I mean, in some matchups it isn't as impactful, but it's never really bad. I mean, adding an advancement requirements to it. I mean, sometimes it doesn't matter that much. They can get like if they have to over advance a Vitruvius or something, they still get a counter out of it.
Right.
But the important thing is that it slows the game down so much versus fast advance and never advance.
Right.
So your drip starts working.
Well, I think
you would just have a lot of drip, and then you still would have to run every server that you put out.
Right. That was the point. That was the point that I was gonna add. I think this is a very clever include for you, because, as you said, your breakers are not efficient. So getting baited into a run, and then it turns out to be an Adonis, not a 3/2, is miserable. So with this deck, with the source, you don't have to check anything that doesn't have an advancement counter on it.
Pretty much, yeah. And the key then, of course, is to keep the source around. I mean, you don't want to play too many of them. They're 2 influence each. Influence is pretty precious in the deck, so you have fall guys. Which also keeps... Also it's a resource, a connection, and costs 0, so it kind of fits in there pretty neatly.
And it also protects your off-campus apartment from getting best defensed.
Yeah.
Which would be pretty nightmarish in this deck.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's definitely, you need to play 3. I've won when that happened. It is recoverable, but it's not pleasant at all. I mean, when you lose most of your drip and most of your stuff, I mean, you can still win, but it's a struggle from there. So preventing that is pretty important. And it's also, the good thing is that it costs 0 and cycles out of hand onto an off-campus apartment as well. So you don't get bogged down too much when installing.
Right. If you have one, there's no reason not to play it down.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And the last piece is Film Critic then, which is like, obviously you still want to be able to score. And Film Critic right now is like, I mean, I think I can't understate really at this point how good this card is and how good it's gonna be with some of the new stuff coming out also, with like Hunter Seeker and so on. So it's basically a card that hoses mid-season and all of that, and it combines excellently then with Source because you
don't actually steal.
You don't steal. I mean, you just host and then you take it off there. Having 2 is actually quite nice. Also, it feels like the second copy is a little bit redundant. I mean, apart from wanting to draw it early, but it's fairly often that you actually are using 2, just because sometimes you multi-access in this build, for instance, with Turning Wheel, and also there is a bit of a tempo there as well. I mean, usually you run like third click or so. You usually want to be able to do May or maybe something else, maybe take money off Catty before running, and then you don't have time to get it off that turn. So it's not the worst thing in the world to leave the agenda on there. And sometimes you hit these like things like 15 minutes and so on that you actually don't want to take off until the end of the game. So having 2 copies is not bad. You don't need 3, but 2 is great.
I'm a Shaper player, so I understand how Film Critic keeps you from dying. Like, Film Critic's just a solid card also if you're terrible at Psy games like I am, and you need to get future perfects. But yeah, it's good.
There's a couple of times also that one thing, maybe the main weakness of the deck, if there is one, is that you don't have any currents.
Yeah, that's true.
So, and there's a couple of currents that you really don't like Door to Door is actually not the worst, but I mean it can still be unpleasant. Since you have Link, there is scarcity of resources, infamously.
That's pretty brutal. The deck that's pretty brutal.
So in that case, sometimes you actually are forced to still take the agenda, pay 3 for the source, and trash a fall guy, which is awful, of course. But sometimes you have to make do with actually not in the Film Critic.
Sometimes hard decisions have to be made. Yeah. So there's a couple of things that I want to jump to just because I think they're interesting includes. So talk to me about the include of Guru Davinder.
I think that he and Polop, in a sense, are the 2 things that, I mean, if you want to start changing around the deck, those are the spots you can dabble with. They're very meta-dependent. I mean, obviously Guru Davinder is a pretty shitty card. It's a reason why he's not in a lot of decks. But in this case, he's a connection, he's a resource, he costs 1.
He's cheap.
And he's cheap, so he cycles out of hand. You can also fall guy him if you don't want to pay the money. So against like a lot of net damage, for instance, if you run into a snare, I mean, it prevents the whole snare for 4. If you have like New Angeles City Hall out, you can actually prevent the tag also, so you're only paying money at that point, and money you have plenty of.
See, I think this is inspired, because if somebody does the 24/7 double boom, you're like, don't care.
No, exactly. I mean, you can protect it with fall guys also, and there's a couple of things. I mean, that, for instance, that it hoses. So it's definitely not bad in the deck. I wouldn't say it's critical to the function, but it depends on the meta. For certain matchups, it's really good. Net damage might actually be one of the harder one as well, because it's you're running through your deck anyways, so your actual hit points aren't that high.
Right.
In that sense, and just having this to be able to prevent like
big
regular
hits.
net damage. Yeah, I mean, it also like stuff like the new barrier Kakugo. I think it is, right? Which is non. I mean, if you have to run through that, you basically are forced to take a net damage, and that can be something that eventually like grinds you out. So it's if you're seeing that in the meta, it's not a bad include. And worst case scenario, I mean, you can still rotate it if it's just minor use for, or just actually throw him away. It's only 1 slot, so it's not the worst thing. And as we said earlier, I mean, you have some leeway with like dead cards in the sense that you're drawing your deck anyways, and you're getting if you're hitting him with May, you're still getting 2 and taking him out of the deck. So it's not the worst thing in the world if you actually manage to come across him in a matchup that you don't need him in.
Right. You have 1 Bagat. I love this card. It's one of my all-time favorites.
It's pretty ridiculous in this. I mean, you basically it comes down to this in this deck. I mean, you have a ton of drip, and you're playing the waiting game with the corp, in the sense that, I mean, eventually they will have to try to get something on the board, and that means that things tend to pile up in HQ also while they're trying to figure out exactly how they can score, because after a while you can actually get in pretty much everywhere. So they have to have a plan for that, and while they're doing that, they're assembling agendas in the hand. And I mean, both Kim loves running the hand anyways, and Bagat just makes that a little bit better in a sense. I mean, it's a sort of multi-access. There is a variant also of the deck we can talk about a little bit later, which is pretty funny, where it gives extra value, where you run Find the Truth instead, and then you can decide if you want to mill the card that you're looking at, if Archives is very open, for instance, but R&D is hard to get to, so you can get it into the bin instead and run it for free,
right?
Pretty much. But it's just giving you a way of being somewhat proactive.
Right.
And of course, being a resource connection kind of helps also.
Yeah. We've got daily cast, which pretty self-explanatory. It's nice drip money. It goes along with leaving our clicks open to install connections.
For sure.
Now, talk to me about the 3D DOS.
If there was anything that was wrong with the Sunny deck, as we said earlier, it was basically that was slow to set up and didn't pressure early. So you're pretty dead in the water towards rush decks with that one. That was what I felt when I was playing against it, because at the time I was running a lot of rush decks and so on. I never really had any problems when facing that deck, but there was something there, obviously, with the whole lockdown. DDoS helps you in the early game by being able to threaten, so they basically have to still be somewhat honest with when they try to score out. It's fairly often that you are able to go in and trash something important, or take off like an early ABT or something like that they're trying to sneak. So it helps a lot. I mean, later on it's moderately useful, I would say, but it's still like if you're hitting it with May, same thing there. You're still getting money, so you're not penalized that much from running.
It's worth noting also, against some decks, they're gonna wait and structure their ice in such a way that a lot of times their most expensive piece of ice ends up being on the outside of the server.
Right.
So exactly. Sometimes the thing that's going to be the biggest tax to your garbage conspiracy breakers is going to be that first piece of ice that you're going to get to avoid.
And the good thing also with running Kim is that, I mean, if you have clicks over after checking the remote, and even if it wasn't anything that you needed to do, I mean, you can still run the hand a couple of times, usually trash something or maybe find an agenda there.
Right.
There is also the whole package. We can talk about that also, which combines with this, which is Scrubber and Soulset Slums. Running a ton of Scrubbers, but it's the meta kind of dictates it. You need to be able to be competitive with
asset
spam, basically, and with running 2 slums and 3 Scrubbers, you have a lot of nice ways of turning down those, turning off the RP spam decks or the other stuff that you don't really love facing that much. And it's also giving you extra value on the hand rounds also, because if you're hitting an agenda, nice. If you're hitting an event, okay, great, you're trashing that. And if you're hitting something else, you can usually Scrubber it away, and maybe even slums it away. So running the hand becomes very, very value after a while in this deck.
Right. So just to go over very quickly our drip econ, besides the daily cast that we've already talked about, is we have 3 of the phone guy. We have 3 underworld contacts.
We know how he works.
Yep. With his weird hand holding a phone like no one ever.
Yeah.
And then we've got Turning a Wheel, which again, I think, as you mentioned, it kind of adds values to our HQ runs where we're trashing things and not seeing agendas.
Exactly. But it's also one way of finishing the game. I mean, if you can bounce a couple of times, and obviously, I mean, we know how good Turning Wheel is. I mean, it's not essential to the deck. It's definitely in those 3-4 last slots. If you're running, for instance, instead then Find the Truth, which is also a resource but costs a lot of influence, you can skip Turning Wheel.
Right.
Archivist.
So Archivist is interesting because it's your additional link source.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because it's really inexpensive.
Yeah. I was well happy when this came out. I mean, I was running access to GlobalSec before that when I was building it initially.
But this is just better because it has an additional effect, right?
It's insanely better. I mean, it was a connection, a resource, costs the same, and you also have actually a very useful effect when you have 2 link. There is a lot of initiative and security agendas. I mean, it's a card that's very hard slotting into the deck. It's definitely powerful in the right decks, but I mean, where do you find the slots for it? In this deck, luckily, I mean, there was already a slot for it, so I just put it in and never looked back.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's just a straight upgrade to access to GlobalSec if you're an Anarch.
It was pretty much made for the deck.
Yeah. So, as we mentioned, you do have one pull-op, which there's a certain things that'll just be very bad for this deck, like Caprice. You don't want to spend a bunch of money getting into a server and then not get in.
Paying 12 for your fantastic breakers to break whatever they put up and then actually being denied is not the best time.
Yeah, it's not the best. So Political Operative's good. It's also good for like a Sandberg that they stash behind something. Exactly. That kind of crap.
Mostly a meta call in that sense also. That's also one of the flex slots, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, but again, it's a 1-cost connection. So it's a draw. Like, the synergy here is out of control. We got New Angelus, which helps us avoid tags since we don't have Aaron Marin. And we've got the Film Critic to keep it around.
Exactly. I mean, you can even run 2 if you're seeing a lot of Railgun and Data Ravens and so on. I mean, it's just a great card, and in this deck it fits pretty well. So,
Cotty Jones is very solid.
Yeah,
also
a
connection.
Important. Yeah, very important. I mean, when you run through your deck that's fast, I mean, she's basically the main source of your late game money.
Right.
You only need to run 1 really, but if you see her early, it's actually also one way of actually spending some of the clicks by just like loading Catty until you're ready to run.
Yeah.
And just holding them down with the threat of the DDoS until she's loaded, basically.
Right. And then the last thing we haven't really talked about is the Ice Carver, which is one of my favorite resources in the entirety of Netrunner, and it just reduces the ice strength of all ice encountered by 1, which is really flips the favorability math on MK Ultra and Black Orchestra for a lot of ice, like a lot.
Yeah, it's actually a fairly crucial econ card in the deck. I mean, the problem is really that some of the ice is just ridiculously well positioned versus like Black Orchestra, and this kind of changes that a bit. Especially Fairchild 3 is a big one.
Right.
So it's usually like where in the matchup where it matters, it's usually like 3 creds discount on a piece of ice.
Right.
To break, so it's fairly massive.
Yeah, and it helps with some MK Ultra stuff as well. Like Cortex Lock becoming Strength 3 is really good.
Yeah.
You know, stuff like that.
Sound too. Yeah, new sound too is also one of those.
Yeah, so there's a lot of value there, and just also with Clippy, like the math on a lot of barriers gets a lot better with Ice Carver down.
Definitely.
Because then you're spending 2, not 3 on Eli's, which doesn't sound like much, but it is.
Yeah, it's up.
Yep. But yeah, this is the deck. I love it. I think it's really interesting and cool. I'm very happy that you published it. We're going to take it for a spin on Jinteki, and we're going to see how we do. Sysp, thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
And everybody watching at home, until we see you again in the test run, always be running.